Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Levin TV on Conservative Review TV, our conservative network. I'm here with a dear friend of mine, the conscience of the Senate, Mike Lee. How are you, sir?
Doing great, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Pleasure is mine.
And I'm here to talk about this with him. This is an outstanding new book. You Levinites out there, history, the Constitution, and so forth. I know that interests you a great deal. Let's start from the beginning. And I want to talk about some current events, too, and we'll work it into the book. This is a substantial book. Why did you decide to write it, and how did you write it, given your schedule and so forth?
It's in part because of my schedule that I decided to write it. It's part of what I do so as not to go insane in the Senate. It's a way of channeling my energy. So a lot of weekends, recess times, long airplane flights, those are all things I have access to. And I decided to write it because I think there are stories the American people need to know. It's one thing to tell them about what the Constitution says. It's another thing to tell them about what I think is the reason certain parts of the Constitution exist. But it makes a much bigger difference if they know the stories behind the people who wrote it and the people who otherwise influenced it.
By the way, how long is that flight from Washington to Utah?
It's about 4 hours.
4 hours.
It varies a little bit depending on which direction, but yeah, it tends to be about 4 hours.
And I suspect you knew a lot of this already, and you probably dug in to get the scholarship, correct?
Yes, exactly. There are some things that I knew already. There are other things that I discovered while writing it. But the important part of it is to make sure that people understand that the Founding Fathers are not just those who attended the convention necessarily. There are other founders who, some of whom most Americans have never heard of, whose stories they need to understand, because when they understand their stories, they understand the Constitution.
Now, you were a clerk.
Yes.
Who did you clerk for?
I clerked for Justice Alito on the Supreme Court. I learned a tremendous amount from him. He's a strong believer in the Constitution, strong believer in liberty, and he's a phenomenal human being and a wonderful Supreme Court justice.
Can I tell you a little story about Sam Alito?
Yeah.
He worked in the Reagan Justice Department, the solicitor's office, and he was the principal deputy. And Charles Freed, who was our solicitor, and was actually quite liberal, Sam Alito decided he wanted to be a political appointee. He'd been a career appointee. And so I was, obviously, for the Attorney General, Ed Meese, as chief of staff, and I handled these things. And I looked at his resume and I said, well, he doesn't have the political background. So I called him in and I interviewed him. And I said, put a memo together for me. So he put a memo together on why he's a conservative and what he had done and so forth. And I sent it to the White House to get him cleared, and they resisted. And then I picked up the phone. I said, clear him. The Attorney General said. So they cleared him. And he got a political position. And that memo came up during his hearings. I'm just saying, that's my experience. And he's a wonderful man, as you're right. He's a brilliant man. He's a soft-spoken man. And on the court, don't you agree? He's done an outstanding job. I mean, I know you were his clerk, but I mean, he's shown absolute fidelity to the Constitution, don't you think?
Absolutely, without question. And you know, in approaching each case, his focus was always on the text. Let's figure out what the text says. Let's figure out whether it's a statute or a provision of the Constitution. Figure out what it says. And that is exactly what the role of the judge should be, to decide what the law is, rather than to decide what the law should be, as some might wish it to be as a matter of policy.
And what does a clerk do exactly on the Supreme Court?
A Supreme Court law clerk serves basically three main purposes. One is to assist the justice in deciding which cases are going to come up for review to the Supreme Court, making recommendations on what we call petitions for writs of certiorari.
Right?
Yeah, when I was there were roughly 10,000 cases where there were parties that wanted review in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard fewer than 100 per year. So the winnowing down of the winnowing process in that depends to some degree on the clerks who review the petitions and make recommendations. The clerks also prepare the justice for oral argument, proposing questions and things like that might be asked, and then the clerks also assist the justice in drafting opinions that the justice might be working on.
Now, you interact with other clerks. Do you ever interact with other justices?
Yes. During any particular year of a Supreme Court clerkship, each justice has 4 clerks, and each group of 4 clerks will take every other justice to lunch at one point or another during that year. And that makes for some interesting conversation, especially, they're all fascinating people. I really enjoyed each of those encounters. I remember, in particular, a very lengthy series of conversations I had with Justice Breyer over lunch, in which we exchanged some very frank views on matters of constitutional interpretation. I also remember that with Justice Ginsburg, she prefers to have the other law clerks come into her chambers for tea. One of my co-clerks spilled the teapot and did so right in front of me, made it look like it was my fault. I was terribly embarrassed.
And was she okay about that?
Yes, she didn't scold me.
And it's interesting, people say that Ginsburg and Scalia were friends. Were they friends?
Yes, they were dear friends. They traveled together with their respective spouses. They enjoyed doing things together socially. Even though they were at opposite ends of the political spectrum, the ideological spectrum, the spectrum as far as how you interpret a statute or provision of the Constitution, they were dear friends.
You know, Scalia, I mean, that really is a big hole in that court, isn't it?
Huge loss. I remember vividly the moment I found out that he had passed. It was a real loss for this country.
It's depressing.
It was,
Yeah.
and especially because he was on the court for almost 30 years. He affected an entire generation, and the way an entire generation would view the law and the Constitution, not just with respect to judging. He revolutionized the way the American people look at the law and the Constitution and the way they go about it in a whole variety of contexts. He's influenced an entire new generation of lawyers and judges who, regardless of their political views, approach the law differently than they would have without Scalia being on the Supreme Court.
The Senate confirmation process has become a complete disaster. And the Democrats took it to the brink this time. And so you Republicans had to stand up in order to get a vote for Neil Gorsuch, who is perfectly qualified. He's not even considered provocative by the left standards. Have we reached a point now that anybody who supports the text, the original meaning of the Constitution, the left will oppose?
It would appear that way, especially when you look at Judge Gorsuch's background. You look at his record. I mean, I reviewed more Gorsuch opinions from the 10th Circuit than I can possibly count. And I couldn't find a bad one among them, nor could I find one that should have necessarily been all that controversial. Because his approach was to say, here's what the law says, let's discern its meaning in this circumstance. That was his approach. That is not a radical thing. At least it should not be radical. And yet they opposed it. If I can say another thing on that confirmation process, I actually think that what happened with Justice Gorsuch's confirmation, what people referred to as the nuclear option, lowering the threshold for bringing debate to a close on a nominee, that had actually happened back in November of 2013. The Democrats purported at the time to be carving out an exception for the Supreme Court. My own personal view is that they went nuclear. They brought the threshold down to 51 back in November of 2013. This was just a logical application of that. Some in the Senate disagreed with me, and that's why we ended up having an additional vote on that. But my view is the die was cast in 2013.